Hello and welcome to today's book summary. The book we're discussing is Challenger, a true story of heroism and disaster on the edge of space. Those familiar with space history might have guessed that it centers on the Challenger space shuttle, which exploded in 1986. Indeed, this book delves into the full story behind the Challenger disaster. Published in May 2024 in the United States. It quickly rose to the top of Amazon's space exploration bestseller list and was selected for the New York Times semi-annual Best Books list. Why has Challenger garnered so much attention? It likely relates to the current space fever. In 2024, whether it's SpaceX's Starship in the US or China's Chang'e lunar exploration program, space projects are receiving extensive media coverage. These initiatives aim to send astronauts to the Moon and even Mars, marking a new peak in human space exploration since the Cold War-era Apollo program. However, faced with the allure of the cosmos, people can't help but wonder, beyond technological challenges, what other risks does human spaceflight entail? What lessons from past experiences are worth revisiting? This is where many recall the Challenger disaster. That catastrophe not only destroyed a $400 million space shuttle, but also claimed the lives of 7 astronauts. Among them was McAuliffe, a high school teacher and the first ordinary citizen to undergo astronaut training in the U.S. For many, their space dreams seemed to shatter along with the Challenger. What made this event particularly impactful was its live broadcast across America. Over 100 million people witnessed the explosion on their TV screens, an experience both searing and shocking. Although the Challenger disaster occurred nearly 40 years ago, its immediate cause has long been established. Many have heard that the culprit was a rubber O-ring seal in the shuttle's external booster. This case is often cited in management textbooks to illustrate how small errors can lead to catastrophic consequences. However, author Higginbotham wasn't satisfied with this explanation. He probed further. Was the O-ring defective in quality or flawed in design? Did the shuttle's manufacturers and operators know about this trap? Moreover, the space shuttle program epitomized by the Challenger lasted only 30 years before being abandoned. Does this suggest the entire shuttle project was a mistake? And who should be held accountable? To answer these questions, Higginbotham spent over 4 years, starting in 2019, interviewing more than 200 individuals connected to the Challenger disaster. His subjects included aerospace engineers, veteran astronauts, and family members of the Challenger victims. Based on these interviews and declassified documents, Higginbotham wrote Challenger. The book's conclusions are alarming. It reveals that the Challenger disaster resulted from a cascading system failure, a cost-cutting government, a whitewashing administration, and risk-concealing suppliers. Each link in the chain was problematic. This dysfunctional system developed a fundamentally flawed shuttle, repeatedly concealed technical issues, and forced the Challenger to launch in unfavorable weather conditions. If we believe that only the small O-ring was at fault, we risk missing the forest for the trees, overlooking more serious systemic issues. In the following sections, I'll introduce the book's main content in 3 parts. First, we'll examine the technical issues that emerged during the development of the Space Shuttle program, exemplified by the Challenger, and why these problems remained unresolved. In the second part, I'll analyze the common faults discovered after the shuttles were put into service and how these issues were glossed over. Finally, I'll summarize the ominous signs preceding the Challenger's final launch and how it was ultimately doomed by an out-of-control system. 1. A flawed platform. To understand the Challenger disaster, we must first discuss the Space Shuttle program. In July 1969, the first American astronauts landed on the Moon, marking the triumphant success of the Apollo program. Over the next 3 years, 5 more lunar missions followed, bringing immense prestige to the United States during the Cold War. However, you might not know that the Apollo program ended abruptly. In 1972, the Nixon administration decisively announced there would be no more manned lunar flights. Why? The answer is simple: it was too expensive. The Apollo program, which began in 1961, lasted 11 years and employed up to 400,000 people at its peak. The Saturn V rocket and lunar module used for moon landings were single-use, costing over $400 million per launch. According to NASA's 1973 estimate, the entire lunar program cost $25.4 billion, equivalent to $257 billion today. This sum could have built 16 of the largest aircraft carriers. With the U.S. economy struggling in the 1970s, the government was tightening its belt. They couldn't cut daily expenses to fund a moon dream, so the Apollo program became the sacrifice. Not only was the government short on funds, but public sentiment towards the lunar program was also souring. When Armstrong first stepped on the moon in 1969, he was hailed as a national hero. However, as subsequent missions returned safely, public interest waned quickly. People began to question, with the Vietnam War already draining resources, why waste so much money on a barren rock 400,000 kilometers away? In the later stages, social activists protested at launch sites, demanding that the government spend money on public welfare instead. By the final Apollo launch in 1972, television broadcast rights couldn't even be sold due to public fatigue. This was bad news for NASA, which relied on taxpayer money. While lunar missions could be paused, manned space exploration couldn't be abandoned entirely. The reason was simple. In 1971, the Soviet Union developed a low-Earth orbit space station. This platform had military applications, capable of carrying heavy radar, which posed an imminent threat to the U.S. With America's technological prowess, developing its own space station wasn't an issue. However, using the massive Saturn V rocket for each astronaut transport would be a heavy financial burden. More critically, the generation of scientists responsible for the lunar program was nearing retirement by the 1970s. America's next-generation launch vehicle needed a fresh start. Saving money, engaging the public, and developing a new vehicle from scratch seemed like an impossible triangle. Surprisingly, after nearly a decade of work, NASA developed a vehicle that met these requirements: the Space Shuttle, the protagonist of this book. A single shuttle cost nearly $400 million, but was reusable. After each mission, it could re-enter the atmosphere and land independently like a glider. Over its 10-year design life, the more it was used, the lower the cost per launch. NASA nicknamed the shuttle the Space Truck, emphasizing its practicality and cost-effectiveness. The public engagement issue was also addressed. The shuttle's spacious interior could carry 27.5 tons of scientific equipment and accommodate 7 astronauts. NASA planned to launch a Citizen in Space recruitment program, including a news anchor or a school teacher among the 7 astronauts to conduct lectures in space. This was an excellent publicity stunt, sure to ignite public enthusiasm. As for technical issues, a single shuttle combined the functions of a rocket and a spacecraft, allowing for bold technological iterations on a single platform. However, the new project brought new problems. Let's explain the shuttle's structure. The familiar oval-shaped part, resembling a regular aircraft, is called the orbiter, the main body of the shuttle with 3 main engines and 2 smaller ones for orbital maneuvering. But to launch this 100-ton iron lump into space, the main engine's thrust alone wasn't enough. So before launch, the orbiter stood vertically on the launch pad, strapped to 2 external booster rockets. On the orbiter's back was an orange, thermos-shaped external tank for the main engine's fuel. During launch, the external boosters ignited first, propelling the entire vehicle to an altitude of 45,000 meters. Then the boosters detached, and the orbiter ignited its main engines, continuing to climb towards low Earth orbit with the heavy thermos on its back. Once the thermos was depleted, it too detached, leaving the orbiter in orbit ready for its mission. The external boosters, after separation, fell into the ocean for recovery and reuse, saving more costs. Note that this cost saving refers to future operational costs. During development, necessary expenses had to be incurred. It was precisely over the development budget that NASA and the U.S. government began to clash. NASA wanted to equip the orbiter with an escape pod for astronaut safety in emergencies. They also wanted to reduce the external tank size and store the main engine's fuel internally for safety. However, this would significantly increase the orbiter's size and weight, pushing the development budget to $14 billion. The government's response was firm, only $5.5 billion, not a penny more. To accommodate this budget cap, NASA had to make tough choices. The escape pod was too heavy, so it was scrapped. Internal fuel tanks were too expensive, so they stuck with the external thermos. When selecting subsystem suppliers, NASA prioritized low-cost bidders, regardless of their industry experience. Famous lunar astronaut Shepard quipped, "The shuttle's crew is sitting in a cheap contraption assembled by the lowest bidders." Budget constraints created another hidden danger: the external boosters. Since the Apollo program, NASA had used liquid fuel rocket engines, which were also installed on the orbiter. These engines could be restarted, and their thrust adjusted. However, liquid engines were delicate and would be ruined if they fell into the sea. NASA had promised that the external boosters would be reusable. To fulfill this promise, they turned to the U.S. Air Force for help. The Air Force suggested using solid fuel engines, similar to those in ballistic missiles, mature technology, cheap, and resistant to seawater. The problem was that solid fuel engines had an inherent flaw. Once ignited, they couldn't be extinguished until all fuel was consumed. The author describes the solid fuel external boosters as two large firecrackers. The orbiter couldn't independently control these firecrackers strapped to it. Their ignition was done on the ground. It took 122 seconds to fly from the ground to 45,000 meters altitude. During this time, astronauts could only pray for divine protection. If the external boosters malfunctioned during this period, they would not only burn through their solid fuel but could potentially ignite the liquid fuel in the thermos. This would cause the entire shuttle to explode, leaving no chance for escape. At this point, you might think NASA was quite pitiful, a complete pushover in this budget war. But the author argues that NASA wasn't innocent. They made two major mistakes. The first was overpromising. To get the shuttle project approved by the government, NASA hired an unreliable assessment company to cook the numbers. This company claimed that launching a shuttle would cost only $350,000 in optimal conditions, compared to $185 million for an Apollo spacecraft. This seemed like a huge difference. What the data didn't reveal was that the $350,000 price didn't include fuel and maintenance costs. And this optimal condition could only be achieved if the shuttle launched weekly, an impossible feat in reality. The assessment report also stated that the probability of a shuttle accident was 1 in 100,000. When the U.S. government later analyzed the Challenger disaster, they calculated the real probability as 1 in 100, a 1,000-fold difference. The responsibility for falsifying figures and deceiving superiors lies solely with NASA. NASA's second mistake was risking the use of immature new technologies. A prime example is the heat-resistant tiles covering the orbiter's surface. The orbiter itself was made of aluminum alloy, unable to withstand the high temperatures of atmospheric re-entry. NASA covered it with a layer of silicon dioxide tiles. These tiles were light, thin, yet heat-resistant, a new achievement in U.S. materials science. Each shuttle was covered with over 30,000 of these tiles. The problem was that the tiles couldn't be nailed down, only glued. And because the orbiter's contours weren't straight, different areas required tiles of varying thickness. As a result, suppliers had to create individual molds for each of the 30,000-plus tiles, which were then manually attached to the orbiter's surface. Even so, tiles would fall off every time the orbiter was transported or moved. If any small part or ice chunk hit a tile during launch preparations, it could crack or puncture, exposing the aluminum body underneath. This would cause the orbiter to burn up completely during re-entry. The problem of falling and damaged heat-resistant tiles plagued NASA for 30 years, unsolved until the shuttle program's retirement. Yet they claimed externally that everything was normal and there was no need for concern. You might wonder. Regarding the heat-resistant tiles, NASA was the client, and the product was manufactured and installed by suppliers. Couldn't the client demand better quality? The author concludes, it was impossible. The tiles were produced and installed by the defense giant Lockheed Martin, a long-term NASA partner. Almost the entire shuttle project was dominated by powerful defense contractors like Lockheed Martin and Rockwell. These companies had been collaborating with NASA since the Apollo program, forming a deeply intertwined interest group. NASA had already squeezed its contractors on price, making it difficult to impose additional demands. Thus, the much-anticipated space shuttle was an inherently flawed platform from the start. More troubles awaited it. 2. Concealed malfunctions. We've just reviewed the series of technical challenges the space shuttle faced during its development phase. Nevertheless, NASA managed to cobble the project together. However, at the last minute, the U.S. government made another budget cut, reducing the number of orbiters from 6 to 5. Excluding one engineering test vehicle without engines, only 4 were actually usable. Challenger was the second of these, assembled in 1981 but not launched until 2 years later. Logically, with fewer shuttles, they should have been used more frequently. So why the long delay? The answer is simple: defects emerged. On April 12, 1981, the first space shuttle, Columbia, made its maiden launch. During ignition, the external boosters burned apart on the wing. Some debris fell off, creating a small hole in the orbiter's ceramic tiles. Fortunately, this hole was on the bottom and not too deep, avoiding serious consequences. However, the second flight encountered new problems. When technicians recovered the detached external boosters, they found that an O-ring rubber seal had been destroyed by high temperatures. This seal's function was to control the internal pressure when the solid fuel ignited. Because the fuel generates high-temperature, high-pressure gas at the moment of ignition, without control, it could ignite the entire fuel compartment, causing the booster to explode. The seal, with a cavity below it, was meant to dilute the gas, allowing the fuel to burn slowly rather than detonate instantly. The seal's destruction indicated that this safety valve was unreliable and needed attention. NASA didn't take this new risk lightly. They directly approached Thiokol, the O-ring manufacturer, to investigate the problem. Thiokol, a long-standing chemical company and NASA's veteran insider, studied the issue and came to a very perfunctory conclusion. The temperature at booster ignition exceeded NASA's initial specifications. However, they claimed this wasn't a problem because there were 2 seals. If the upper one burned, the lower one could still function. In other words, this module had safety redundancy and wasn't prone to failure. NASA reluctantly accepted this explanation. However, troubles continued to mount. During Columbia's 5th flight, a spacesuit malfunction forced an early return. The newly completed Challenger also faced numerous issues. In February 1984, during its 4th launch, equipment failure nearly resulted in the loss of 2 satellites worth $180 million. During re-entry, ice falling from a drain valve punctured 3 heat-resistant tiles, almost causing another tragedy. In July 1985, Challenger's 8th launch was also fraught with complications. Due to a sensor malfunction on the external booster, ground staff urgently shut down the engines, taking over 2 weeks to investigate before resuming the mission. By now, you've probably realized that the newly delivered space shuttles were far from stable vehicles. From heat-resistant tiles and O-rings to spacesuits, almost every subsystem had hidden dangers, severely undermining NASA's touted economic efficiency. According to NASA's promises, the shuttle needed to launch 55 times a year to reduce operating costs to an ideal level. However, from April 1981 to January 1986, the 4 shuttles launched only 25 times in total, averaging just over 5 launches per year, with a quarter of these experiencing accidents or safety concerns. The U.S. space program was not saving money compared to the past. The The problem was that getting NASA to admit its mistakes was impossible. The book's author discovered that NASA had developed a unique institutional culture during the Apollo era called "go fever." This meant that since so much manpower and resources had already been invested in the project, constituting a huge sunk cost, stopping now would render everything futile. Better to push on stubbornly. Who knows? It might succeed. Within NASA, any employee emphasizing safety concerns or advocating for shuttle launch delays was seen as an outsider. Over time, opposing voices disappeared. However, with repeated shuttle launch delays, NASA needed to account to the government and public. So, in the early 1980s, NASA focused most of its energy on public relations and publicity. Here are a few examples. In 1983, the first American woman astronaut flew on Challenger. The same year, the first African-American astronaut successfully went into space. In 1985, a Saudi prince boarded Discovery for a spaceflight. Subsequently, 2 congressmen took space trips on the shuttle. McAuliffe, the teacher chosen for Challenger, was selected from over 11,000 applicants and underwent astronaut training. The entire process became almost a reality show, igniting space fever among the American public. However, the Saudi prince, the 2 congressmen, and McAuliffe were not responsible for operating the shuttle or conducting scientific research. Their title was payload specialist, essentially equivalent to passengers, more for publicity than practical value. This is not to say that McAuliffe and the previous female astronauts lacked personal capabilities. They were highly professional and extremely brave. But using gender, skin color, and ordinary citizen status as promotional tools while refusing to disclose the shuttle's technical flaws to the astronauts was playing with fire. NASA also had tactics for dealing with the U.S. government. In 1981, President Reagan took office. He was a staunch Cold War believer and a supporter of the U.S. space program. NASA seized this opportunity, pitching the ordinary citizen in space idea to Reagan, quickly gaining his favor. NASA promised that although the shuttle had numerous problems initially, from 1986 onwards, they would complete at least 1 launch per month, ensuring the Reagan administration would gain face. Of course, promises had to be kept. NASA's strategy was to shorten the inspection and maintenance time for the orbiter and boosters after each mission. They also established an unwritten rule. Once the orbiter was on the launch pad, it must launch on schedule unless faced with unavoidable natural disasters or major technical failures. This was already disregarding risks. Of course, it would be an exaggeration to say the entire U.S. aerospace industry was engaged in face-saving projects. Thiokol, the O-ring manufacturer, had a responsible engineer named Alan McDonald. He had been studying the problematic O-ring since 1981 and discovered a fatal issue. While the double O-rings wouldn't be completely destroyed under high temperatures, the Kennedy Space Center, where shuttles were launched, had very low winter temperatures. Ice would form on the exposed booster surface, and the internal O-rings would lose elasticity due to the cold. Rubber rings without elasticity would naturally contract, exposing gaps at the edges. If ignition occurred suddenly, high-temperature gases could seep through these gaps, detonating all the fuel and causing a major accident. The problem was, if Thiokol reported this defect to NASA, admitting quality issues in their product, their reputation would be damaged, potentially losing new government contracts. Therefore, Thiokol only vaguely informed NASA that low temperatures affected the O-ring's performance, without specifying to what extent. Yet another defect slipped through. 3. The tragedy of a rushed launch. We've just reviewed the series of problems that emerged after the space shuttle was put into service. These were also the root causes that ultimately doomed Challenger. However, the Challenger disaster itself could have been avoided up until the very last day. So why did it still happen? Let's delve into this. On the morning of January 27, 1986, Challenger's orbiter and boosters were erected at Kennedy Space Center. According to NASA's earlier promise, 1986 was to be an acceleration year for shuttle launches. Challenger was not only to deploy 2 satellites but also observe Halley's Comet's trajectory near the Sun, a mission with only a 48-hour window, necessitating a launch no later than the 28th. The original plan was to launch on the 27th, but, unexpectedly, the orbiter's door wouldn't close, taking most of the day to repair. The 27th passed without a launch. Coincidentally, Thiokol's engineer McDonald was at the launch site. Preoccupied with the O-ring issue, he kept a close eye on the weather forecast. Bad news soon arrived. On the night of the 27th, temperatures at Cape Canaveral would drop to -8 degrees Celsius, rising to only -3 degrees Celsius the next morning. The lowest temperature for previous U.S. shuttle launches had been C. McDonald, concerned that the O-rings would contract in low temperatures with irreversible consequences, insisted on reporting the situation. On the evening of the 27th, he participated in a conference call with Launch Center management, NASA officials, and Thiokol representatives, firmly stating that he couldn't guarantee the O-ring's safety if temperatures fell below 12 degrees Celsius. However, Thiokol backstabbed McDonald, claiming the low-temperature issue was merely a personal opinion, not the company's stance. The company supported continuing with the launch. Nature, however, silently supported McDonald. At dawn on the 28th, inspectors were shocked to find a layer of ice on Challenger's launch pad. This time, even Rockwell, the orbiter's manufacturer, couldn't remain silent. Their representatives stated that melting ice could damage the heat-resistant tiles or be sucked into the engines, necessitating a launch abort. At this critical moment, NASA's acting administrator Graham exerted pressure. Graham, Reagan's confidant who had just taken office a month earlier, had already boasted to the president that there would be no launch delays in 1986. Moreover, TV crews had arrived at the launch site, with over 100 million people nationwide waiting to watch the live broadcast. Under high-level pressure, Challenger underwent only simple de-icing before launch. At 11:38 a.m., Challenger slowly lifted off. Within just 3 seconds, sea gases penetrated the gaps at the edges of the O-rings, forming a plume of black smoke. At this point, the boosters' tails were spewing fire, which, following the airflow, first ignited the boosters and then the orange external fuel tank. At 72 seconds, the fuel tank exploded entirely. The orbiter was torn into pieces, scattering into the sea. Over a month later, the U.S. Navy salvage team found Challenger's wreckage on the seabed, over 100 meters deep. They discovered that at least 3 of the 7 astronauts were still alive when the explosion occurred. They had activated emergency oxygen packs, struggling to survive, only to plunge into the sea with the crew compartment. Thus occurred the greatest tragedy in human spaceflight history. To investigate the cause of the Challenger disaster, the U.S. government bypassed NASA and formed the Rogers Commission, inviting renowned physicist Richard Feynman to participate in the investigation. The fatal O-ring problem was finally made public. In the final report, Feynman wrote, "For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled." U.S. shuttle launches were consequently suspended for over 2 years. Tragically, in 2003, Columbia also exploded during a mission, with another technical flaw, the heat-resistant tiles, as the culprit. The U.S. ultimately decided to abandon the shuttle platform. But the 7 Challenger crew members who sacrificed their lives will never return. Conclusion. That concludes the main content of Challenger for you. Nearly 40 years have passed since the Challenger disaster. The history of human spaceflight has finally turned the page on the shuttle era, entering a new phase. However, the lessons left by Challenger are eternal. They concern not just that small O-ring, not just technical issues, but also inherent flaws in institutional culture and human nature. The poor performance of the U.S. space system in this incident was a result of both greed and the desire for quick success. These issues extend far beyond space exploration: how to escape the mental trap of go fever, how to maintain caution in the face of risks, These are lifelong lessons for all of us. Congratulations, you've finished another book.